Dragon's Dogma 2 is the sequel to one of my favorite games of 2012 that I played in 2016. Specifically, the Dark Arisen re-release was a certified family video favorite. The sequel runs in the same vein, an action RPG with a focus on exploration, character customization, and the constant reassembling of a squad of loyal pawns. It released March 2024, and it took me around 60 hours to complete the story and 20 more to obtain the Platinum Trophy. The broad strokes premise of the Dragon's Dogma series is that the world is held in an unending cycle. A dragon appears to destroy the world, and in doing so chooses a human to act as his opposition, stealing the human's heart and reanimating them into a hero known as an Arisen. The story of this game is almost identical to the story of the first, with the addition of some light geopoliticking that doesn't actually resolve by the end of the game. Anyways, the Arisen is able to control a population of not quite humans known as pawns. These are basically soulless humans and demi-humans that don't really die but don't really live. They exist only to obey orders and lack any real will or motive of their own. They come from some other world beyond the Rift, and it's not really clear what exactly they are, but I'd say they're a true neutral version of an angel. At the start of the game, we design our main character as well as our main pawn. The main pawn will always accompany us, and we can also add 2 additional pawns to our party. These are almost entirely the creations of other players, with a few of Capcom's default pawns thrown in as well. The character creator is incredibly powerful and intuitive, and it even allows someone with relatively little patience to make a unique, realistic character in no time at all. It's also detailed enough that it can be used to accurately reproduce pretty much any famous character or face, so naturally half of the pawns you encounter are Kratos, and the other half are waifu. The director of the game, Hideaki Asuno, has some interviews floating around that describe the intention of the game's monster designs to be immediately recognizable on a nearly folkloric basis, a sort of drilling down to the elements, so when a griffin appears for the first time, everyone who sees it will immediately go, "Oh, yes, that's a griffin." I think they very much succeed at this, and in a certain way, the strict adherence to traditional mythology makes the game unique in how default it is. The creatures in this game are standard fantasy, for better or worse. I quite like it, but I do wish there were a larger variety of enemies. Once we're in the game proper, the world is lush. It's yet another fantasy Europe, but it's also incredibly detailed. There's sweeping vistas around every corner, and the mix of natural beauty and foreboding caves and specklings of ruins were enough to give me a real drive to wander and explore aimlessly. But despite the incredible fidelity of the textures, shading, and the somewhat worse animations, there's a pretty huge problem with the graphic design of this game. There's little care paid for the actual presentation. I've seen a lot of very cinematic videos of players taking down giant enemies with really stellar camera angles, and sometimes this does line up naturally and it looks great. But the reality is that the majority of combat doesn't actually look like that. I was fighting the camera pretty constantly. Without a lock-on feature, the camera stays dead in place unless you're actively manipulating it. There's no allowances made to phase out spell effects occurring in the foreground, so most fights devolve into a blind button mash. Maybe the camera is more responsive on the PC, but on the PS5 it's pretty rough. There's an option slider to slightly pull back or push in, but I ran into similar issues no matter where I set the camera. It's like throwing the Mona Lisa behind privacy glass. Since this is an RPG, there is a lot of dialogue, and the same presentation problem occurs. Dialogues are handled in-engine, and once someone starts talking, you lose control of your character, but they don't move into a logical position, they just stand where the dialogue started. So the scene becomes 2 people facing in different directions, and lip-syncing poorly while you swivel the camera to see if it looks less stupid from another direction. It doesn't. All the graphical power in the world doesn't help when the scenes have hostile cinematography. The actors aren't blocked out in logical places, the lighting seems random, and it ends up like a lazy nightmare. If you compare it to a game like Yakuza 0, which has worse graphics but extremely intentional scene blocking, even for minor interactions, Dragon's Dogma comes off seeming downright amateurish, despite the vast improvement in graphical fidelity. There are a few cutscenes, primarily related to the main quest and some of the big set-piece side quests, that are more traditionally constructed, and these are mostly good. Of particular note is the Sphinx, who asks the character for objects via riddles, and when you present her with an object, she responds like this.
Greatest worth your eyes descried. Why? 'Tis a worthless bauble, fit only to beguile the foolish.
It's some genuinely creepy tension, especially the first time it happens. But the presence of these cinematic cutscenes really draws into sharp relief how bad the dialogue interactions are. But the actual design of the setting, the moment-to-moment ambience of sunken ruins, sun-soaked badlands, and lively forests, that part is stellar. The game gets full marks for exploration. It's a similar feeling to when I first played Oblivion or Elden Ring. You see something in the distance, you investigate, get sidetracked in a tomb or a cave, and memorable situations spontaneously develop from that. It's miles above the hollow, checklist-driven open world of a modern Far Cry or Assassin's Creed. It's really engrossing the first time you traverse an area, but there is a slight problem. Side quests almost entirely involve crossing huge portions of the map, generally through areas you have already explored. There's very limited options for fast travel, and there's no framework to randomize, alter, or otherwise make the second run from Vermund to the border town any different from the 100th. So about 30 hours of my playthrough involved running down paths I had already explored, fighting enemies I had already defeated, and every time it became just a little more tedious, until I ended up really frustrated and just plowed back through the main story in an attempt to get it over with. There is also an encumbrance system in play here, and every item has weight, and there are a ton of items to find, ranging from upgrade materials to crafting materials. Once you hit heavy encumbrance, you will run substantially slower and be less able to sprint, encouraging you to drop what you don't need or return to town to stash it. Equipment is always just a linear upgrade, and I rarely obtained anything that made me rethink the way I wanted to play, which is a shame. I like it when I find a magic sword that makes an overlooked ability suddenly useful, or grants a bonus I couldn't have guessed existed. It's one of my favorite things in gaming, but it just isn't here, and finding new equipment doesn't really excite the desire to adventure as much as some other games. There's a limited fast travel system. A pre-established ox cart route runs the length of the map and can be taken pretty cheaply, but more often than not these rides are interrupted by a cyclops crushing the wagon, and then 20 minutes of running. It also keeps the port crystal system. Essentially, the player can obtain a handful of portable fast travel markers that require a rare consumable fairy stone to use. I actually really like the port crystal system. It encourages a bit more care and exploration than something like Skyrim. I just wish you could use the larger static port crystals to fast travel without burning a fairy stone, especially considering the sheer volume of returning to town you'll be doing. I can't deny the high of exploring a new area, but there isn't enough enemy variety, randomized scripted events, or simple alternate paths to support the amount of back and forth demanded by the side quests. It becomes tedious long before the story concludes, and I suspect I would have had a better time if I ignored the side quests entirely. Combat keeps fresh through the use of the vocation system. There are 10 vocations. Some are merely evolved forms of the starting 4, but in general, each class plays wildly different from the others. There's no unified dodge or block button. It's different for each class, with some classes having no ability to avoid damage other than careful positioning. Each vocation has 9 levels, with a series of static bonuses and activatable combat abilities learned as they level up. Although each class has around a dozen abilities, only 4 can be brought into combat at a time. They are activated by holding down the right shoulder and then clicking the assigned button. To change abilities, we can either rest at a camp or return to town, but to learn new abilities, you'll be returning to town after each level up. I can't stress enough, there's a lot of returning to town in this game. Equipment is also locked to vocation selection, so you can't play dress up as effectively as you might like. Oddly enough, there's friendly fire enabled, but only for the physics system. Your arrows won't strike pawns, but your boulders will. It's kind of weird. For larger enemies, you can cling and climb across their bodies to maneuver to weak spots, like eyes or glowing pimples. It seems like the directional movement is somehow tied to the specific limb you're on, and I never really got the hang of it in my playthrough. Sometimes pressing the movement stick upwards would move me towards the top of the monster, and other times it would make me circle around a limb. Combined with the aforementioned camera issues, oftentimes I would have no clue what was happening when trying to scale a monster. Fighting the large monsters is a highlight of the gameplay though. Each of them has a variety of specific conditions that can lead to a knockdown state, where you do massive damage. Figuring out these little gimmicks is a ton of fun, and carefully observing how your pawns interact with enemies can lead you to a lot of interesting strategies. There is a bit of a pacing issue with the game. Enemies are either immortal punching bags that take 5 minutes of dedicated assault, or they die at a glance. It changes as you get better equipment, but it never felt like there was a sweet spot where enemies were difficult enough to require advanced tactics, but not so difficult that the fights dragged on forever. This isn't that different from the first game, but it's something I had hoped they would have improved over the last 12 years. The nature of battles is also incredibly chaotic, with your dedicated 3 pawns frequently being joined by the numerous passerby on the roads. If you've got any type of wizard involved, the battle will quickly become too cluttered to really see or respond to. Overall, the combat is uneven. It's hard to design encounters that are equally fun for 10 different play styles.
You do well to strike. Well, let's begin. That was well fought.
As a general evaluation, it seems like this game tried to cover so much ground on so many fronts that a lot of gameplay aspects end up feeling shallow. That's how I'd describe the combat: ambitious but not incredibly well realized. There are also far too few enemy types to support an 80-hour game. There are maybe 6 basic enemy types, like goblins and undead, that have a few upgraded variants. They have some rare instances of specific behavior, like the forest goblins camouflaging themselves or setting rolling boulder traps, but the bag of tricks runs empty pretty quick. Combat with these groups can both move way too fast and unpredictably to be tactical, but somehow slow down to a tedious slog at times. Speaking of which, this game loves Tedium. It oozes out of every interface and design choice. It's the only explanation I've got. What other reason could there be to have fully separated buy and sell menus at merchants? To require us to return to town on every vocation level up, or not to let us access gear storage when making camp? Why doesn't it let us save equipment selections or inventory loadouts for classes, or any of another million choices that would have let us spend less time staring at menus or walking to specific NPCs to open their menus? Is it really an integral gameplay component that every time I change vocation, I need to first go to the vocation guild, dialogue with the guildmaster, backtrack to the inn where I dialogue with the innkeeper, to open the withdraw from storage menu to grab my class-locked gear, then back out to the start menu, go to the inventory screen to equip it. Oops, if you want to see how the equipment actually looks, you'll need to go to the equipment screen to equip it, then talk to the innkeeper again, go to the deposit menu, and put my class-locked old gear away. Was that the best use of my time? There's 1,000 examples of these slight, piled annoyances. The problem with an 80-hour game is that a little 5-second aggravation in the gameplay loop becomes a stabbing, hour-long headache by the time credits roll. An issue built into any 100-hour game is the story getting a bit lost in the clock. I'll put a little spoiler warning before I dig in. The immediate story is recognizable to anyone who played the first game. You're the Arisen, the dragon stole your heart, and now it's your job to kill the dragon and keep the world from ending. And yet again, the simple black and white fairy tale expands into something more nuanced and cyclical. After all, the Arisen wouldn't be a hero at all if the dragon never existed, so the two share a fundamental linking that the game explores. But that doesn't come into play until we're almost at the end of the game. To begin with, there's a bit of light Game of Thrones politicking going on. Every newly made Arisen is the rightful ruler of the country of Vermund. However, the current Queen Regent has usurped the crown by planting a false Arisen on the throne, and is colluding with a sorcerer from a neighbor nation to replicate the Arisen's control of pawns, in the hopes of slaying the dragon on her own and retaining power for her son. The sorcerer character has found a way to control pawns by mixing the fossilized souls of Arisen and dragons. It seems there's some sort of plan to dispense of the dragon and unite the usually belligerent kingdoms, but it isn't expanded upon. In fact, the more human plot threads never really resolve. At the halfway point we leave Vernworth and pretty much never see the queen again, and chasing after the sorcerer leads us directly to our combat with the dragon, so we don't get a satisfactory conclusion to any of the politicking. This game is really more focused on the deep lore, the inner workings of the world. In the first game, an Arisen who destroys the dragon proves themselves worthy of becoming the next Seneschal, a godlike being that was once an Arisen and has ascended to guard the world, while their own divinity is sucked out to keep the world alive. And when a Seneschal has nothing left to give or no longer sees the point in the cycle, they curse a failed Arisen to become the dragon, who sets out to find a new Arisen who kills the dragon and usurps the Seneschal, and the cycle continues. Dragon's Dogma 2 is about the collapse of this cycle. Our Arisen meets the Seneschal far too early to challenge him, and the Seneschal reveals that he is actively preventing the cycle from continuing. As he became powerful, he noticed a god behind the stars, observing him, and came to the conclusion that his accomplishments were just a trivial amusement for some greater being, that he is nothing more than a lion roaring in a zoo. Consequently, he kills every Arisen that attempts to usurp him, letting their souls wash out to sea and crystallize instead of taking his place, and the cycle is stalled out. We're introduced early on to an enigmatic power known as the Pathfinder, but are only drip-fed information on it. The Pathfinder seems to be an avatar of the Greater Will, also called the Watcher, essentially a god that has designed this entire multiverse of worlds and cycles for its own viewing. A god that wants to witness the same story over and over, so has created a self-sustaining system for that story to be eternally told. But the actors of this cycle have decided they hate to be viewed, hate to have observation as their only purpose, and the world is actively rebelling against its creator. The creator is desperately trying to correct the system, guiding centuries of unworthy Arisen to confront the Seneschal, almost like retelling a punchline over and over. And after the player reaches the true ending by rebelling against their fate, the Pathfinder wipes the board clean, destroys the creation, and sends bizarre, twisted versions of the dragon in the hopes of setting the Arisen back on the right path. Finally, we confront the Watcher in his own dragon form and slay him. His last words,
"My heart, it aches." A new world comes. A new tale is set to unfold. Yet, it seems I will not be there to watch it.
He won't be there to see it. He won't be there to control it. Mark the breaking of the chain, the birth of a world with free will, and the end of the cycle. And then we're thrown into New Game Plus, where the cycle repeats. The game's major theme is struggling against the rigidity of power, the absolutes of fate, of characters in a narrative contending against the all-powerful author's intention, going beyond their role as pawns to become fully fledged people. We are constantly helping NPCs escape from overbearing power structures, whether that's helping an elf break cultural norms to become a better archer, or helping the Queen Regent's son see more of the world outside his gilded cage. The quests are more binary than the original Dragon's Dogma, with more clear-cut pass-fail states and less of the open-ended, sprawling decision trees that left you wondering what the right choice was. As the major theme of the game has shifted from the importance of free will to the shackles of fate, This retooling of quest design seems intentional. As I mentioned earlier, this game's setting is designed to feel recognizable and almost acts as a fantastical commonplace. When you see a Cyclops, it's immediately identifiable as a Cyclops, with no twists or reinterpretations involved. Likewise, the two environments we pass through are both incredibly straight-faced versions of a fantasy Europe and fantasy Middle East. The almost universal nature of the world and the beasts therein, along with the millennium-old plot of a chosen knight facing down a dragon, points towards a broader statement on tale-telling and narrative as a whole, of the creation and endless recycling of worlds that can only repeat their established message for the faint enjoyment of distant watchers. Us. Isn't it our insatiable appetite that brings these derivative worlds into creation? Aren't we the idle gods that rage when the story doesn't work out the way we want, throwing our little tantrums if we don't see the good guy kill the dragon and become a king? Don't we secretly want to witness the same old stories we've always loved? Don't we want new games that are just like our favorite game from 2012, without any changes, yet somehow innately improved, without the removal of any of the usual gaming niceties, regardless of whether they break the meaning of the ending? And then we're thrown into New Game Plus, where the cycle repeats. Dragon's Dogma 2 is really a hard game to sum up. I loved it more than I hated it. There was so much potential, so many good ideas, and they were so close to being well realized. That's what hurts the most. This game is collapsing inches from the finish line. So close to perfection, but landing just shy. Combat was incredible at times, and a real slog through the muck at others. The graphics are great when you can see them. The music has gone full fantasy without the little metal edge the first game had. The story is almost impossible to parse without doing some external searching, and all of the human politicking goes completely unresolved. And the biggest annoyance I had ended up being how large the world is. And yet, my first expedition into each new area was completely captivating, and I was fully drawn into this world at times. I loved figuring out how to topple a Cyclops, learning the timing on the warrior's heavy attacks, chucking enemies off cliffs and riding griffins across the map. Even the incredibly banal stuff my pawn said ad nauseum really grew on me by the end of the game.
This is generally used as a material.
Different combinations of materials result in different creations.
Nothing in it felt quite as well developed as it should have been, and mechanics seemed to be working fully independently of each other. But the first 8 hours were magical, aimlessly wandering the world and spelunking in dark ruins. And now, away from the controller for a few days, I look at the trusty old pain scale and admit, in the beginning it was really excellent. Only at the end did all the little annoyances start to get to me. I'd average it out and give it a somewhat painful. Honestly, I'd recommend skipping a lot of the side content if you pick this one up. Or maybe just have more patience than me and be content to take things slow. Hopefully they'll continue the cycle of the first game and release a Dark Arisen version next year that fixes all the issues and makes it a perfect game. But I probably won't be ready to give it another try then. Well, that wraps up my 16th review. Thanks for tuning in.
Corpse will serve
See you.
us well. You cut quite the hunter's figure.